The train had barely cleared the station when my phone flashed with my sister Danielle's name. I almost let it ring out. Danielle never called unless she wanted something, and lately the only thing she wanted was the house I was living in. Still, the phone kept vibrating in my hand, sharp and insistent, and something cold tightened in my chest. I answered. Danielle's voice came through light and confident, the tone of someone delivering news she believed would end a story. "I thought you should know," she said smoothly. "Everything you own is in the trash." For a second, the words refused to settle into meaning. The train rattled along the tracks as Savannah blurred past the windows, and I pressed the phone tighter to my ear. Danielle laughed under her breath, amused by my silence. "Don't bother coming back," she added. "We cleaned the house out this morning." Then the line went dead before I could respond. A second later, another notification appeared. My mother had posted a photo in the family group chat. A green dumpster sat behind my grandfather's house, its lid thrown open like a display case. Inside were shirts, a cracked picture frame, and several cardboard boxes spilling out the small fragments of a life. Anyone looking at it would believe everything I owned had been dumped there. My father reacted with a laughing emoji. Danielle followed with a message announcing the house finally belonged to her and that the garbage truck would soon finish the job. Around me, the morning commuters kept scrolling through their phones or staring blankly out the windows, unaware that my own family had just gathered to celebrate what they thought was the end of my story. Instead of answering them, I opened the secure folder on my phone. The video waited there exactly where I had left it 2 days earlier. 36 seconds long. That was all the time my grandfather had managed before the illness stole the rest of his strength. I studied the frozen thumbnail while the train carried me toward downtown Savannah. Malcolm had warned me not to release the recording unless my family forced the truth into the open. As I looked again at the photo of the dumpster and Danielle's smug messages beneath it, I understood they had already crossed that line. Without writing a word, I attached the video to the group chat and pressed send. The progress bar crawled across the screen as the train rattled through another stretch of track. When the upload finished, the recording appeared directly beneath my mother's photograph. I locked my phone and slipped it into my bag, watching the river glide past the window as if nothing unusual had happened. Less than a minute later, the phone began vibrating relentlessly. Danielle called first, then my father, then my mother. I ignored them all. By the time the train reached the next station, more than 30 missed calls covered my screen. Messages exploded beneath the video in the group chat. Danielle demanded I delete it immediately. My father insisted there must be some misunderstanding and that we needed to speak privately. My mother's texts were shorter and far more desperate, warning that releasing the recording would destroy the family. Their panic grew with every passing minute. The same people who had laughed about throwing my belongings into a dumpster were now begging me to answer. I switched the phone to airplane mode and slid it back into my bag. The train doors opened at the next stop, and passengers stepped off calmly, unaware that the storm unfolding inside my phone had just cracked open years of carefully buried lies. When the train finally arrived near the glass office tower where I worked, the streets were already filling with morning traffic. I stepped through the revolving doors and rode the elevator to the compliance department on the 12th floor. My coworkers greeted me the same way they always did, completely unaware that my family was probably still staring at the 36 seconds my grandfather recorded during the final week of his life. I had just opened my laptop when the receptionist called my desk phone. Her voice carried a trace of confusion. 3 visitors were standing in the lobby asking for me. When I glanced through the window toward the street below, I saw Danielle's silver car parked near the entrance. My parents stood beside her, their faces tight with anger. In that moment, I understood exactly why they had come. The video I released on the train had not only ruined their celebration, it had forced them to face the truth my grandfather had been too weak to reveal while he was still alive. And judging by the way Danielle was pacing near the doors, they were about to make their next mistake in front of an entire building full of witnesses. The receptionist sounded uneasy when she told me my family was waiting in the lobby. For a moment, I stayed seated at my desk, staring at the city outside the tall windows while the morning traffic crawled slowly along the street below. I already knew why they were here. The 36-second video had done exactly what my grandfather intended. It had forced the truth into the open, and my family had reacted exactly the way Malcolm predicted they would, loud, angry, and desperate to regain control. I took the elevator down alone. Each floor passed with a soft chime while my thoughts moved back to the moment my grandfather recorded that video. He had been sitting in the hospital bed, his voice thin but steady, holding the phone with both hands as if he understood the importance of every word he was about to say. Even then, he knew the people closest to him might try to erase what he had discovered. When the elevator doors opened into the marble lobby, the sound reached me before I even stepped out. Danielle's voice echoed across the wide room, sharp and furious. She stood near the reception desk arguing with the security guard while Trevor paced beside her with his phone pressed against his ear. My parents stood a few feet away looking pale and uncomfortable, as if they had not expected the confrontation to unfold so publicly. Several employees slowed their steps when they noticed the argument. Office workers carrying coffee cups paused near the entrance, quietly watching the scene as if it were something from a television drama instead of a real family dispute. Danielle saw me the moment I stepped out of the elevator. Her expression shifted instantly from anger to something more intense. She marched across the lobby toward me, her heels striking sharply against the marble floor. "You need to delete that video right now," she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Whatever twisted story you think you're telling ends today." I remained still while she spoke. The security guard followed close behind her, clearly worried the situation might escalate. Trevor joined her a moment later, his face flushed with anger. "You're spreading lies," he said, pointing a finger toward me. "You think you can ruin people with some staged recording?" Their voices bounced off the tall ceiling while more employees gathered quietly near the edges of the lobby. My father stepped forward then, lowering his voice as if trying to sound reasonable. "This doesn't need to happen here," he said. "You're embarrassing the family. Let's talk somewhere private." I looked at each of them for a moment before answering. "You started this in public," I said calmly. "The photo in the group chat was public enough." Danielle's eyes flashed with anger. "That video is fake," she snapped. "Grandpa never said those things." Before I could respond, Trevor spoke again, louder than before. "You manipulated him while he was sick," he said. "You made him say those things so you could steal the house." The accusation hung in the air for a moment. Several people in the lobby exchanged surprised looks, clearly realizing this was no ordinary family disagreement. The security guard finally stepped forward between us. "I'm going to ask everyone to lower their voices," he said firmly. "This is a private building." Danielle ignored him completely. "You think you can destroy our lives with one video?" she shouted. "Delete it now before this gets worse for you." Instead of answering, I simply looked toward the security guard. "These people are causing a disturbance," I said quietly. Within seconds, 2 more guards arrived from the hallway behind the reception desk. They asked my family to leave the building immediately. Trevor protested first, insisting they had the right to speak to me. Danielle argued loudly that she wasn't going anywhere until I deleted the video, but the guards were already guiding them toward the doors. My father tried one last time to speak calmly, telling the guards there had been a misunderstanding, but the decision had already been made. The glass doors closed behind them and the lobby slowly returned to its normal, quiet rhythm. People began walking toward the elevators again, whispering softly about what they had just witnessed. I rode the elevator back to the 12th floor and returned to my desk. For a while, I focused on my work, trying to ignore the tension still sitting in my chest. Late that afternoon, Marcus called me. His voice carried the same controlled urgency I remembered from the night we first discovered the missing money. "You should see what Danielle just posted," he said. A moment later, a link appeared on my phone. When I opened it, Danielle's message filled the screen. She had written a long public post accusing me of stealing from my grandfather while pretending to care for him during his illness. She described me as manipulative, dishonest, and desperate to control the inheritance. The post had already begun spreading through our extended family and local community. Dozens of comments were appearing beneath it, some confused, others openly supportive of Danielle's version of the story. Marcus spoke again while I scrolled through the message. "Don't respond," he said calmly. "Just take screenshots of everything." I followed his instructions, saving every part of the post before sending the files to Malcolm Reyes. Malcolm called less than 10 minutes later. His voice sounded steady, almost satisfied. "She just made our case easier," he said quietly. Outside the office windows, the evening light was fading across the Savannah skyline. Danielle believed that attacking me publicly would protect her version of the story. Instead, she had just created the evidence Malcolm needed to take the entire situation into a courtroom. Marcus called again later that night after Danielle's post had spread through half the town. I was sitting at the small kitchen table in my apartment, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop while the Savannah skyline flickered beyond the window. My phone vibrated softly against the wood as his name appeared. The moment I answered, his voice carried the same steady focus I remembered from the night we first began tracing the missing money. "I archived everything," he said. "Every comment, every message, every share. She can delete it later, but it's already preserved." I leaned back in my chair while he spoke, listening to the quiet hum of traffic outside. Danielle's post had grown longer over the past hour as she continued adding details meant to strengthen her story. She claimed I had manipulated my grandfather during his illness, isolating him from the rest of the family so I could influence his decisions about the estate. She wrote that the video circulating online was fabricated and that I had forced him to record it while he was confused and weak. Hundreds of people had already seen the message. Some believed her. Others asked cautious questions. A few relatives tried to defend me, but their voices were quickly buried under the flood of speculation spreading through the comment section. Marcus spoke again after a moment. "She's panicking," he said quietly. "That kind of accusation doesn't come from confidence. It comes from fear." I closed the laptop slowly and stood up, walking toward the window that overlooked the quiet street below. The city lights reflected softly against the river in the distance. For a moment, I remembered the hospital room where my grandfather had recorded the video. The machines beside his bed had been humming quietly while he spoke, his hands trembling slightly as he held the phone steady. He had known exactly what he was doing. "I sent everything to Malcolm," Marcus continued. "He's already reviewing it." Almost on cue, my phone buzzed again with another incoming call. Malcolm Reyes rarely wasted time once a situation reached this stage. I thanked Marcus quickly and switched to the new call. Malcolm's voice sounded calm, almost analytical, as if he had already mapped the entire situation in his mind. "I've read Danielle's post," he said, "and I've reviewed the screenshots Marcus sent. She just crossed a very important line." I remained silent, letting him continue. "Public accusations of fraud carry consequences," Malcolm explained, "especially when financial records exist that can contradict them." He paused briefly before continuing. "I also filed something earlier today." The words caught my attention immediately. "Filed what?" "A formal request for review," he replied. "The withdrawals from your grandfather's accounts are now part of an official inquiry. The court will examine the transfer history connected to Trevor's company." For a moment, the room felt completely still. Danielle believed she had turned public opinion against me with a single dramatic message. What she didn't realize was that Malcolm had already begun moving the situation into a legal process where opinions meant very little. "What happens next?" I asked quietly. Malcolm answered without hesitation. "The court schedules a preliminary hearing. Once the judge reviews the financial records and the video, the case moves forward." I walked slowly back toward the kitchen table, my thoughts returning to the photograph Danielle had posted that morning. The dumpster behind my grandfather's house, the laughing emoji my father had added beneath it. All of that had happened less than 12 hours earlier. "They're not expecting this," Malcolm continued. "Your family thinks this is still a personal dispute. Once it enters the court system, everything changes." Outside my window, a police siren passed somewhere in the distance, its echo fading into the quiet streets. Malcolm lowered his voice slightly. And there's something else. I waited. The bank records Marcus uncovered show more than one transfer, he said. The first was small, easy to ignore, but the second withdrawal was much larger. How large? I asked. Malcolm didn't answer immediately. Papers shuffled softly on his desk before he finally spoke again. $45,000. The number hung in the air like a weight pressing against the silence of the room. That money moved through Trevor's company account 2 weeks before your grandfather died, Malcolm continued, which means the timing becomes very important once investigators review it. I stared at the dark screen of my phone for a moment after the call ended. Danielle had spent the evening trying to convince the world that I had stolen from our grandfather. But the truth was already sitting quietly inside the bank records Malcolm had just filed with the court. And once a judge saw those numbers next to the video my grandfather recorded, the story my family had tried to control would begin to unravel in a way none of them could stop. The next morning, the city woke under a pale gray sky that hung quietly over the Savannah River. I arrived at the office earlier than usual, long before most of my co-workers stepped through the glass doors downstairs. The lobby was calm again, the polished marble floors reflecting the soft light from the tall windows. Nothing in the building suggested that less than 24 hours earlier, my family had been standing there shouting accusations in front of half the staff. I rode the elevator to the 12th floor and set my bag beside the desk. My computer screen glowed softly as I opened the files Malcolm had forwarded overnight. Several documents sat in the secure folder he shared with Marcus and me. The first was a timeline of the bank transactions connected to my grandfather's account. I stared at the numbers quietly while the office around me slowly filled with the sounds of the workday beginning. The first withdrawal had been small, $15,000 transferred quietly through an online authorization. On its own, it could have been explained away as a medical expense or a mistake, but 2 weeks later, another transfer appeared beneath it. $45,000. The money moved through a company account connected to Trevor before disappearing into a series of smaller transactions. Marcus had spent hours tracing the movement of those funds. His notes were written carefully beside each entry, explaining where the money had gone and how the accounts were connected. By the time I finished reading the document, the pattern was clear. This had never been a misunderstanding. Someone had deliberately redirected the money while my grandfather was too sick to notice. My phone vibrated softly beside the keyboard. A message from Malcolm appeared on the screen. The hearing had been scheduled. I read the short text twice before responding. The court had agreed to review the financial records and the video during a preliminary hearing later that week. It would not decide the entire case immediately, Malcolm explained, but it would determine whether the evidence justified a deeper investigation. For the first time since Danielle's phone call on the train, the situation felt real in a different way. What had started as a cruel joke in a family group chat had moved steadily into something far more serious. Later that afternoon, Marcus met me at a quiet cafe near the river. He arrived carrying a small laptop and a stack of printed bank statements. The cafe windows looked out over the slow-moving water where cargo ships drifted past the docks in the distance. Marcus opened the laptop between us and pulled up another set of documents. "There's more," he said quietly. He pointed to a series of transactions I had not noticed earlier. Several smaller withdrawals appeared in the months before my grandfather passed away. Each amount was different, spaced just far enough apart to avoid attracting attention. When combined, they formed a number that made my chest tighten. Nearly $70,000. Trevor's name appeared repeatedly beside the transfers. Marcus leaned back in his chair, watching my reaction carefully. "It wasn't just the 2 withdrawals Malcolm mentioned," he said. "There's a pattern." Outside the cafe window, the afternoon sun reflected off the water, while tourists walked slowly along the riverfront promenade. The normal rhythm of the city felt strangely distant compared to the numbers glowing on Marcus's screen. "Does Danielle know?" I asked. Marcus shook his head slowly. "If she did, she wouldn't have posted that message accusing you of fraud." He closed the laptop gently and slid the printed documents across the table. Malcolm thinks the hearing will focus on the video first, he said. But once the judge sees these records, the situation changes. The thought settled heavily in my mind as we finished our coffee in silence. That evening, I returned to my apartment and sat for a long time near the window overlooking the quiet street below. Cars passed occasionally, their headlights moving slowly across the pavement. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked briefly before the neighborhood returned to silence. My phone buzzed again just after sunset. Danielle had posted another message online. This time the tone was different. Instead of accusations, she wrote that the situation had been misunderstood and that private family matters should not be discussed publicly. She insisted the conflict would be resolved soon and asked people to stop speculating about the story circulating through town. I stared at the message for a long moment before locking the phone. The change in her tone meant only one thing. Someone had warned her about what was coming. 2 days later, the courtroom would open its doors, and the 36-second video my grandfather recorded would finally be played in front of a judge. And once that happened, the numbers Marcus uncovered would begin telling a story far more damaging than anything Danielle had written online. The courthouse stood quietly beneath the morning sun when I arrived with Malcolm Reyes 2 days later. The pale stone columns stretched high above the steps, and the wide square in front of the building was already filled with people arriving for their own hearings. Lawyers moved quickly across the plaza, carrying folders and briefcases, while courthouse staff guided visitors toward the entrance. To anyone passing by, the morning looked ordinary. Inside courtroom 3, however, nothing about the day felt ordinary. Malcolm walked beside me through the long hallway, holding a thin leather folder that contained the financial records Marcus had uncovered. The quiet echo of our footsteps followed us across the polished floor as we approached the wooden doors. When we entered the courtroom, Danielle and Trevor were already seated at the opposite table with their attorney. My parents sat behind them, their expressions stiff and uncomfortable. Danielle's eyes met mine briefly before she looked away. The confidence she had shown during the confrontation in my office lobby seemed thinner now, as if the certainty she once carried had begun to crack. The courtroom filled slowly while the clerk prepared the documents at the judge's bench. A few local reporters had taken seats along the back row after hearing about the unusual estate dispute spreading through the community. Marcus arrived quietly and sat beside me, offering a brief nod before placing his own notes on the table. When the judge entered the room, the quiet murmur of conversation faded instantly. Trevor's attorney spoke first. His voice carried a calm confidence as he explained that the video circulating online had been misinterpreted. He described the situation as a private family disagreement that had been exaggerated by rumors and social media. According to his argument, the recording my grandfather made did not prove that any crime had occurred. Danielle sat beside him, nodding slightly, her hands folded tightly together on the table. When Malcolm stood to respond, he did not begin with the video. Instead, he opened the folder and placed several printed pages on the table before him. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "this case is not based solely on a recording. It is supported by documented financial activity that occurred during the final months of Mr. Whitaker's life." The courtroom projector flickered to life as Malcolm connected his laptop. A series of bank statements appeared on the screen behind him. Each page showed a timeline of withdrawals from my grandfather's account. The first transfer appeared small. $15,000 moved quietly through an online authorization. Malcolm explained that the amount alone might not have raised suspicion, but the second transaction appeared directly beneath it. $45,000. A soft murmur moved through the courtroom as the numbers appeared clearly on the screen. Malcolm pointed to the destination account connected to the transfer. Trevor's company name appeared beside the transaction history. Trevor shifted slightly in his chair while his attorney whispered something quickly beside him. Malcolm continued speaking calmly, guiding the judge through the timeline Marcus had reconstructed. Smaller withdrawals followed the larger transfer, each one spaced carefully across several months. Together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. When Malcolm finished explaining the financial records, he paused briefly before making one final request. "Your Honor, we would like permission to play the recording Mr. Whitaker made shortly before his death." The judge nodded once. Malcolm pressed a key on the laptop, and the 36-second video filled the courtroom screen. My grandfather appeared sitting in a hospital bed, his voice weak but steady as he spoke directly into the camera. He explained that he had discovered money missing from his accounts while he was undergoing treatment. He named Trevor directly and said he feared Danielle might already be aware of what was happening. The final sentence in the video was quiet but unmistakable. If anything happened to him before the situation was resolved, the recording was meant to expose the truth. When the video ended, the courtroom remained silent for several seconds. Danielle stared down at the table while Trevor whispered urgently to his attorney. The judge reviewed the documents again before speaking. "The court finds sufficient cause to review the financial activity connected to these accounts," he said evenly. "A formal investigation will proceed." The words hung in the air like a final bell. Trevor's attorney attempted to respond, arguing that the transfers could still have legitimate explanations, but the judge had already made his decision. The hearing concluded shortly afterward. As people began leaving the courtroom, the tension that had filled the room slowly dissolved into quiet conversation. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sunlight spread across the square as reporters gathered near the steps, hoping for statements from either side. Danielle and Trevor exited through a side door with their attorney, avoiding the waiting crowd. Marcus stood beside me near the railing overlooking the plaza. "That went better than expected," he said quietly. I looked back toward the courthouse entrance where my parents were slowly walking toward their car without speaking to anyone. The video my grandfather recorded had finally reached the place he intended for it. A courtroom where the truth would be measured not by anger or accusations, but by the evidence quietly waiting inside a set of bank records. The courthouse square had nearly emptied by the time Malcolm and I stepped onto the sidewalk. The afternoon sun had pushed the gray clouds away, leaving the city bright and calm in a way that felt strangely disconnected from the tension inside the courtroom only minutes earlier. People walked past carrying coffee cups and shopping bags, unaware that a quiet legal decision had just shifted the direction of my entire family's future. Marcus joined us near the stone railing that overlooked the plaza. He held his phone loosely in one hand while scanning a few new messages that had already begun circulating online. News about the hearing was spreading faster than anyone expected. Several people who had been in the courtroom had posted short descriptions of what they had witnessed, and the comments were already multiplying beneath those posts. Danielle's name appeared again and again. For the first time since the situation began, the conversation was no longer controlled by the version of events she had written online earlier that week. Malcolm closed his leather folder and rested it against the railing beside him. "The investigation will take some time," he said calmly, "but today moved the case into a completely different stage." I nodded slightly, still watching the courthouse doors where people continued to exit quietly. "What happens next?" I asked. Malcolm looked toward the street where cars moved slowly through the afternoon traffic. "The financial records will be examined in detail," he explained. "Investigators will trace every transfer connected to your grandfather's accounts. If the money moved the way Marcus's analysis suggests, Trevor will have serious questions to answer." Marcus slid his phone back into his pocket. "And Danielle's posts won't help him," he added. The thought lingered as we walked slowly across the square toward the parking lot. Danielle had spent days accusing me of fraud and manipulation in front of hundreds of people online. Now those same accusations would be examined beside the financial records she never expected anyone to uncover. A sudden shout interrupted the quiet rhythm of the plaza. Danielle's voice echoed from the far side of the courthouse steps. She and Trevor had just emerged from a side entrance with their attorney walking a few steps behind them. The moment she saw me standing near the railing, Danielle changed direction and walked quickly across the plaza. "Are you happy now?" she demanded before anyone could stop her. Her voice was sharp enough to turn several heads nearby. "You think you've won something?" she continued. "This isn't over." Trevor stood slightly behind her, his expression tight with frustration as he glanced toward Malcolm. Malcolm stepped forward calmly. "This isn't a place to argue," he said evenly. "The court will handle the matter." Danielle ignored him. "You manipulated everything," she said, pointing toward me. "You used Grandpa to make us look like criminals." For a moment, the plaza fell strangely quiet around us. I looked at her without raising my voice. "Grandpa recorded the video himself." Her expression tightened instantly, as if the simple sentence had struck a nerve she could not easily defend. Trevor finally stepped forward then, placing a hand lightly on Danielle's arm. "Let's go," he said under his breath. But Danielle pulled her arm away. "You're destroying this family," she said, her voice shaking with anger. Malcolm's tone remained steady. "If you have something to say, you should say it in court." The words seemed to break the last thread of Danielle's confidence. She stared at us for a moment longer before turning sharply and walking back toward Trevor. Their attorney hurried after them while speaking quietly into his phone. The confrontation ended almost as quickly as it had begun. Marcus exhaled slowly beside me. That was predictable. We watched silently as Danielle and Trevor crossed the plaza and disappeared toward the parking garage at the far end of the square. The moment they vanished from view, the tension around us seemed to fade. Malcolm checked his watch before speaking again. "The investigators will contact the bank this week," he said. "Once they start pulling the full transaction records, the picture becomes clearer." I looked back toward the courthouse doors one last time. A few reporters were still standing near the entrance discussing the hearing. They had not yet realized how large the financial trail behind the case might actually be. Marcus followed my gaze and gave a small nod. "Once they see the numbers," he said quietly, "this story won't stay quiet for long." The afternoon sun reflected off the courthouse windows as we walked slowly across the square, leaving behind the building where my grandfather's 36-second message had finally begun turning into something far more powerful than a family argument. The weeks after the hearing passed more quietly than I expected. Savannah continued moving through its normal rhythm while the investigation worked slowly in the background. Cargo ships drifted along the river, tourists wandered through the historic streets, and the courthouse square filled each morning with people arriving for their own cases. On the surface, nothing seemed different, yet beneath that calm, the financial records Malcolm had submitted were being examined line by line. Marcus called me almost every evening with updates from the investigators. Each time his voice carried the same mixture of calm focus and disbelief as the numbers continued to reveal themselves. The bank records stretched further back than anyone had predicted. What originally looked like two suspicious withdrawals had slowly expanded into a chain of transactions moving through Trevor's company accounts. The total amount approached $75,000. None of the transfers were large enough individually to draw attention, but together they formed a pattern that investigators could not ignore. The money had been moved carefully across several months while my grandfather was in and out of the hospital. Each withdrawal followed the same path, leaving his account before appearing inside one of Trevor's business accounts within days. Marcus showed me the full transaction map one evening at the same riverfront cafe where we had first studied the documents. The laptop screen displayed a timeline stretching across nearly half a year. Small arrows connected each transfer, forming a quiet trail of numbers that told a story more clearly than any argument Danielle could make online. "This wasn't panic," Marcus said quietly while pointing to the screen. "This was planning." The thought stayed with me long after we left the cafe that night. 2 weeks later, Malcolm called again, his tone steady but slightly different from before. "The investigators finished reviewing the bank records," he said. "They've submitted their findings to the court." I stood near the window of my apartment while he explained what that meant. The report confirmed that the transfers had not been authorized for legitimate medical expenses. The funds had been redirected through Trevor's company accounts and later dispersed through several smaller payments connected to unrelated business expenses. In legal terms, the pattern was clear: financial exploitation of a vulnerable patient. Malcolm told me another hearing had been scheduled. The courtroom felt even quieter the second time I entered it. Danielle and Trevor were already seated at their table with their attorney, but the confidence they had shown during the first hearing had vanished. Danielle kept her eyes fixed on the papers in front of her, while Trevor whispered nervously with his lawyer. My parents sat behind them again, their expressions tense and silent. When the judge entered the room, the hearing began quickly. Malcolm presented the investigator's report along with the full financial timeline Marcus had reconstructed. The documents were projected onto the courtroom screen, showing the sequence of transfers with clear timestamps and account numbers. Trevor's attorney attempted to argue that the funds had been moved for business purposes with the intention of being returned later. But the explanation weakened as Malcolm continued presenting the evidence. Several of the withdrawals had occurred on days when my grandfather was undergoing medical treatment and could not have authorized them personally. The authorization codes attached to the transactions were traced back to Trevor's login credentials. The courtroom remained silent as the judge reviewed the documents. Danielle shifted slightly in her seat while Trevor leaned forward, whispering urgently to his attorney. After several minutes, the judge finally spoke. "The financial activity described in this report demonstrates sufficient evidence of unauthorized transfers," he said evenly. "The matter will proceed to criminal review." The words seemed to drain the remaining color from Trevor's face. Danielle looked toward my parents as if expecting them to intervene, but they remained still. The hearing ended soon afterward, leaving the courtroom filled with the quiet sound of chairs sliding across the floor as people began standing. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered again near the steps, hoping for updates about the case that had slowly captured the attention of the local community. Trevor and Danielle left quickly through a side exit with their attorney, avoiding the growing crowd. Marcus stood beside me at the top of the steps, watching the reporters below. "That's the moment everything changes," he said quietly. I looked back at the courthouse doors behind us. The 36-second video my grandfather recorded had once been nothing more than a quiet warning saved on my phone. Now it had become the first piece of evidence in a case that would follow Trevor far beyond the family house he once believed he could quietly control. The final hearing arrived on a quiet autumn morning when the air over Savannah felt cooler than it had in months. I stood at the top of the courthouse steps for a moment before going inside, watching the sunlight move slowly across the historic square. Cars passed along the street while a few early reporters waited near the entrance, hoping the case that had been quietly unfolding for weeks would finally reach its conclusion. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt heavier than before. Danielle and Trevor were already seated with their attorney, but the tension around their table was unmistakable. Trevor looked exhausted, his shoulders tight as he flipped through a stack of documents. Danielle stared straight ahead, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. My parents sat behind them again, silent as they had been during every hearing. Malcolm took his place beside me while Marcus quietly settled into the chair behind us. The courtroom filled slowly as the clerk arranged the final documents on the judge's bench. When the judge entered, the room fell into complete silence. The proceedings began with the investigator's summary. The report confirmed what the financial records had already suggested. Over several months, funds from my grandfather's account had been transferred into business accounts connected to Trevor. The pattern of withdrawals showed careful timing, occurring when my grandfather was hospitalized or unable to monitor his finances. The investigator explained that the authorization codes attached to the transactions had been traced directly to Trevor's access credentials. Trevor's attorney attempted one final defense, arguing that the transfers had been temporary business loans that were meant to be repaid. But the explanation collapsed under the weight of the documentation. No repayment records existed. Instead, the funds had been distributed through unrelated expenses connected to Trevor's company. When Malcolm stood to speak, his tone remained calm and precise. He reminded the court that my grandfather had recorded the video because he suspected something was wrong. The recording was not speculation. It was a warning he left behind when he realized the people closest to him might try to hide the truth. For the final time, the 36-second video was played in the courtroom. My grandfather's voice filled the room again, weak but steady as he explained what he had discovered. When the video ended, the silence that followed felt even heavier than during the earlier hearings. The judge reviewed the documents quietly before delivering the final decision. The court confirmed that the financial transfers constituted unlawful exploitation of a vulnerable account holder. Trevor would face criminal charges related to the unauthorized withdrawals, and the remaining estate assets would remain protected under the conditions my grandfather had established. Danielle's earlier accusations against me were formally dismissed as unsupported claims. The words were spoken calmly, without drama, yet they carried the weight of everything that had unfolded since the day Danielle called me on the train. The hearing ended shortly afterward. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sunlight filled the square as reporters began asking questions near the steps. Trevor left through a side exit with his attorney, avoiding the cameras waiting outside. Danielle followed quietly behind him, her expression drained of the confidence she once carried. My parents left without speaking. Marcus stood beside me near the railing overlooking the plaza, while Malcolm closed the leather folder that had carried the case from the beginning. For a moment, none of us said anything. Across the square, the city moved calmly through another ordinary afternoon, completely unaware that the long conflict surrounding my grandfather's house had finally reached its end. Later that evening, I returned to the old house for the first time since the hearings had begun. The porch looked exactly the way it had when my grandfather used to sit there watching the evening traffic pass along the street. I placed the small wooden box containing his belongings on the table beside the chair where he once rested. Inside the box was the phone he used to record the 36-second message that had changed everything. Without that simple moment of courage, the truth might have disappeared forever. Standing there in the fading light, I realized that what happened was never really about revenge. It was about protecting the truth when others tried to bury it. If you've ever faced a moment where someone tried to rewrite your story or silence your voice, you probably understand why this ending matters so much. I would really like to hear your thoughts about this story and what moment surprised you the most, so feel free to share it in the comments below. And if stories about family conflict, hidden truths, and quiet justice interest you, consider staying with this channel and subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for spending this time with me and being part of this community. This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.